So the term for this is called prison gerrymandering. It's when they build prisons in predominantly white, rural, Republican communities. And the majority of people that we incarcerate in this country, in each state, is usually black and brown people out of urban developments or bigger cities. Now, these smaller rural communities that are predominantly white tend to vote Republican. This is where they build all the prisons. Now, they take all the people out of these cities who tend to vote Democrat and lock them up. When they lock them up, they then count them at the prison for the population census. The prison becomes their official place of residence. The number of representatives is determined by the population of your local district. So when you're counting inmates in these districts, you're increasing the population, effectively increasing the voting power. The problem is these inmates cannot vote. They have no voice, which in return gives the actual residents in that district more voting power, all the while diminishing the voting power of the districts that you're arresting these people out of. Prison gerrymandering is a very dirty game, and it's how Republicans keep power in Florida. They have the trifecta. They have a supermajority. They've got the House, the Senate, and the governor's mansion because of prison gerrymandering. Florida's slap full of prisons in rural-ass communities in BFE all throughout North Florida mostly, in which now you're giving these people who live there so much more representation and voting power and say in our democracy than the communities that are actually more densely populated and have a majority of the people. I wish more people would become educated on this so we can band together and vote to have this shit changed. This is why Republicans love voter suppression so much. This is why they do not want convicted felons to vote, but they want to put one in the White House.
So let me tell you, they love to use our bodies to apportion us in an inaccurate way. It is called prison gerrymandering. The numbers show that in rural Texas, they were constantly bleeding population. Urban Texas was growing exponentially. But what they do is they count inmates where they are imprisoned instead of counting them where it is that they will return to. So their family members that are in Dallas, Texas, or Houston, or wherever, their family members, when they need something, they call us, even if it's relating to that inmate. But somehow rural Texas is getting better roads than they probably deserve because they're counting those inmates that are not driving on those roads. They're counting those inmates that are not using their hospitals. They're counting those inmates whose children are not attending their schools because of prison gerrymandering. We have a black and brown incarceration issue, not just in Texas, but in this country. And in fact, the state of Texas incarcerates more people than any other independent democratic country. That is how bad our incarceration is just in the state of Texas. And I've got so many great colleagues on this committee that actually benefit from being able to do things like that. So listen, this is about resources. It's about putting the resources where the people are.
So many people are well versed in what gerrymandering is, but have you heard about prison gerrymandering and why it needs to be stopped? So every 10 years, the U.S. Census Bureau conducts a count of the population. This data is then used by states so they can draw the maps for their congressional and legislative districts. The point of this is to ensure that residents have adequate representation. It's supposed to be one person, one vote. This requires states to draw districts that are roughly equal in population. But what about the incarcerated population? So basically, when conducting an overview of the country's population, they count people at their usual residence, where they sleep the majority of the time. So if a person is in prison, where they sleep the majority of the time is in that institution. But why is this a problem? One, people who are incarcerated do not get to choose which institution they get to sleep at. So although they're technically living in this community, they have no ties to the community that they are being housed in. Number two, most people who are incarcerated cannot vote. In fact, only 2 states allow inmates to vote. That is Maine and Vermont. So a district that houses a prison can contain the same number of people as neighboring districts without prisons, but only a percentage of people in that district can actually vote. So technically, the vote cast by an individual who lives in a district with a prison will have a vote that carries more weight than an individual who cast a vote living in a district without a prison. This is clearly a violation of the constitutional principle, one person, one vote. Third, let's take into account the demographic considerations when discussing prison gerrymandering. It is a well-known fact that our prisons are filled with majority Black and Hispanic people. In fact, Black inmates make up roughly 38.8% of the inmate population. And since being Hispanic or Latino is technically an ethnicity and not a race, many of them are being counted as white, even if they're of Afro descent. But I digress. So if the majority of prisons are filled with Black and brown people, where are the majority of prisons built? In rural, predominantly white communities. So if you're a Black person from an urban community that predominantly votes, let's say, Democrat, and placed in a prison that's in a rural, predominantly white community that votes Republican, is there adequate representation here? Especially since you can't vote. Which leads to the diluting of the voting power of residents in urban districts, which are often more racially diverse. And this is how Republicans in states like Florida, where I live, keep a stranglehold on political power. This is why they have the trifecta right now, a supermajority with Republicans holding the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. Look at all these prisons and major institutions in Florida marked by red dots. You can see there's a whole bunch of them up here in North Florida, up here in the Panhandle. Well, do we think it's a coincidence that Florida's congressional map looks like this? So when they tell you that crime doesn't pay, oh, it pays, especially in the terms of political power. And as my friend Conscious Lee says, education is elevation, research over me-search.
If you had to guess where most prisons are concentrated, would you guess rural or urban?
Do y'all remember the three-fifths compromise? You're supposed to learn it in school. I don't know if they teach it anymore. That's the one where slave states were able to count enslaved people as 3/5 of a person when they were reporting population to the federal government. Now, why is it a compromise? Well, if you count all your enslaved people, you have to pay a lot in taxes, right? But if you count none of your enslaved people, you don't get as much representation and support from the federal government. So they figured we'll pay a little over half the taxes and we'll get a little over half the representation. And the result was that slave states had way more representatives in the federal government than they had people who were eligible to vote. And they thought it was a pretty good deal because that means that their vote counts for more than somebody from a free state. So what do you get when you build all your prisons out in the middle of the country? You get something called prison gerrymandering. The original creator talks about some of this, but I want to break it down a little further. First thing you get is prison towns, where you have mostly white rural towns and every job basically is in the prison. So the economy of that town is totally dependent on prison business. So the people who are in the prisons are not from that town. They're often Black and brown people from urban areas, and they are now putting their place of address as that town. This is where you get a new 3/5 compromise. So that town is now getting more representation in the government based on a population that includes these prisoners who cannot vote. But they're also getting more resources from the government based on a population that is not actually dispersed throughout the town. All the parks and sidewalks and fountains. And the places where these prisoners are from are also being robbed of those resources and of that representation. So it's actually a way better deal than the 3/5 compromise was, because in the 3/5 compromise, they had to pay more in taxes. In this case, they're getting economic incentives and getting more representation and also removing those things from the poorer neighborhoods in the urban areas. Two things you could do about this would be to let people use their last known address when they went to prison and not change their address to that prison. The other thing you could do is just let prisoners vote. There's no reason that they can't vote by mail or that you couldn't put polling places in there other than that we choose not to do it. Some prisoners have a right to vote, but they make it extremely difficult. Prisoners should have the highest levels of voter turnout. They really have nowhere else to be. And if we made it so that they were all legally allowed to vote, that may change the math on some of this.
Do you know that the U.S. Census counts incarcerated people in the wrong place? They count people in prison as part of the community that the prison is in instead of the person's hometown community, where more than 95% of people will return to after they serve their sentence. This is a huge problem because it distributes resources and political power to the wrong places. It's called prison gerrymandering because it has a lot of the same effects as traditional gerrymandering. It skews districting and resource distribution by making some districts seem larger or smaller than they actually are. On September 27th, Senator Sylvia A. Santana read into the official Senate Committee on Election and Ethics Senate Bill 494 that seeks to have Michigan join 12 other states that outlawed prison gerrymandering, but that still isn't enough. As we approach the end of the 2023 legislative session, we need to vote this important bill out of committee and introduce a companion bill in the House. Ending prison gerrymandering is a key part of the Root Cause platform because we understand it's about proper political representation and not funding. It's a common practice that when prisoners need someone to advocate for them, they call loved ones who will reach out to their home district representative. By ending prison gerrymandering, we secure the resources and representation needed to advocate for the resources that prisoners will return to. Remember, ending prison gerrymandering alone won't eliminate gun violence. It's part of a broader strategy that we firmly believe that when you increase resources, you decrease violence. To learn more about the Campaign for a Safer Michigan's Root Cause campaign, you can visit the link in our bio.